Hi, and welcome to Advanced Web Design. I'm your professor, Dr. English Dowdell. Okay, welcome to Module 7. Now, in the last module, we created the foundation for working with databases in PHP. We built a MySQL database, we created a table using phpMyAdmin, and then we connected our PHP website to the database using PDO, and we tested the connection. We also confirmed that our form could send data to PHP using the post method. So now we're ready for the next step. Now in this module, we're going to complete the full workflow. We're going to collect data from a form. We're going to insert that data into our MySQL database securely, and then we're going to display the stored submissions on a web page. Now, this is an important point in the course because now your project starts behaving like a real dynamic web application. Now, instead of just showing a form and, say, printing the values back to the screen, we're now going to store those values permanently and retrieve them later. Now, by the end of this module, you should be able to use the post method to collect form input. You should be able to insert sanitized user input into MySQL database using PDO. Be able to retrieve and display submitted data using select statements and PHP, and then apply basic output sanitation using HTML special characters. Now today's module builds directly on what we completed in Module 6. So if you understood the form, the database table, and the connection file from the previous module, you're in a strong position for this one. Now before we jump into code, let's review the full workflow again. So in Module 6, we work with the HTML form, we work with the MySQL table, and we work with the database connection file. Now in Module 7, we add the missing middle and the final step, which is to insert the submitted form data into the database and then retrieve the stored data and display it on the page. So the completed flow now looks like this. The user fills out the form sends data using POST, PHP is going to collect the data, it's going to validate and sanitize the data, and then it's going to insert the data into the MySQL database. And then we're going to use PHP to retrieve the saved records and then display them in a table. And that's the full cycle of the basic form handling in PHP web application. Okay, let's start with the post method. So when a user fills out a form and they click submit, the form sends the entered value to another file. Now, if the form uses the method equals post, then PHP can access those values using this post array. For example, if a form field has the name attribute, name equals, say, full name, then in PHP, we can retrieve that value using the post array full name. This is why matching your form field names to your database columns is going to be helpful because it creates a much smoother workflow. Now, before we insert anything into a database, we need to talk about validation and sanitation. Now, validation means checking whether the input is acceptable. So, for example, is it a required field or is a required field empty? Is the email formatted properly? Is the user sending data that we expect? Now, sanitation means cleaning up the input before we use it. For example, trimming off any extra spaces, stripping any like tags, like HTML tags or anything, and then preventing unsafe or unwanted input. Now, these are basic but very important habits. Now, even though this is an introductory course, I want you to begin thinking like professional developers. You never want to assume users' input is automatically safe. Next, let's talk about prepared statements. Now, when we insert data into a database, we should not just place raw user input directly into a SQL query. That can create some security issues and break our application. Instead, what we do is we use PDO prepared statements. And these prepared statements, they separate the SQL structure from the user's actual values. And that makes the code more secure and more reliable. So instead of building, say, an SQL like this, insert name, email, and message, and directly into the query string, what we do is we use placeholders and then we bind the values safely. And this is the standard professional approach. And this is what you're going to be seeing in your assignment. Now, once the data is in the database, we need to display it. But even when displaying data, we still need to be careful. If we print database content directly to the browser without escaping it, unsafe content could be interpreted as HTML or script. And that's why we use HTML special character function when displaying input. This converts special characters into safe HTML entities and then helps prevent injection or script issues on the page. So there are two important security habits in this module. One is we're going to be using prepared statements when we insert data, and then we're going to be using the HTML special characters function when we display our data. Okay, now that we've covered the core ideas, and I will provide additional resources in the course room, let's walk through the process live. Now, this demo is going to cover both assignments for this module. First, I'll show you how to update the submit underscore form.php so that it takes the submitted data from our volunteer form and inserts it into the volunteer table securely using PDO. Then I'll show you how to build a submissions.php page that's going to retrieve those records from the database and display them in a readable HTML table. Now, this is going to continue directly from the form, our connection file, and the table structure that we already worked on in Module 6. Okay, all right. So let's get started with the first assignment. So in Module 6, our submit underscore form.php file only displayed the submitted values on the screen so that we could verify that the form and PHP were communicating correctly. Now what we're going to do is upgrade that file so that it actually stores the data in the database. And for this demo, I'm going to be continuing with the volunteer form and the volunteer table from the previous modules demo. Okay, so go ahead and open your website, go to your site tools, okay? And the first thing I want to do is I want to review the forms. I'm going to go to File Manager and within Public, and I've got mine in Module 6, and this is my form here. Okay, and I just want to make sure that my name attributes, like here, full name, email, all of that, matches the database column. So I'm going to go ahead and open up in a separate tab. Okay, so here's my columns here if I want to look at the structure. I click on structure. Browse is just basically browsing your different records. Structure is looking at your structure, in SQL. These are things, and we'll get into that, but these are just ways that we can run queries. So what I want to do is I'm just matching, um, the different names. So we've got, ID, we've got full name, email, phone, availability, message submitted by. And then on my form, I've got full name, okay, email, phone, availability, and message. Now I'm not including ID because remember that is going to be auto incremented by MySQL. It's going to automatically populate that. That's why I've got auto increment here. It's going to automatically populate it starting with 1 and going through every time I add a record, it's going to increment it by 1. And I'm also not including the submitted at because MySQL is going to generate that automatically using the current timestamp, okay, by default. Okay, so at this stage, I'm basically just checking for consistency. And this matters, if the form says like name is, for instance, username, okay, but the database, would say full name, then the workflow is going to become confusing and it's going to be error prone. So step one is always just make sure that your form and your database line up. Okay, now I'm going to look at the form itself and I want to confirm that it says action equals submit underscore form dot php and the method is post. And this tells the form where to send the data, okay, and how it's going to send it. Now, we're using post because this form, this is a form submission data. Okay, we're submitting data, and post is the correct way of doing that. Okay, so now I want to go ahead and I'm going to open up the submit form. Okay, now in module 6, this file, only echoed the submitted values back to the screen. Okay, but in module 7, we're going to expand this so that it does 4 things. One, it collects the form input using the post array. It validates and sanitizes the data. It connects to the database using our existing db underscore connect.php, and then it inserts the data into the volunteer table using a prepared statement. Okay, so first I'm going to collect the submitted values. So let me go ahead and, because I type so slow, this is how I'm going to collect the values, but I'm going to add a little bit more onto this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enclose this in a trim function, and I'll explain it in a second once I do that. Okay, I'm showing you, I've done all of these. I'm just going to show you. So I'm enclosing all of this within a trim function. So that means I have to put the beginning paragraph using the function named trim, beginning paragraph, ending paragraph, and everything in between that. Okay, so let me explain what's happening here. So this post full name, remember, is going to retrieve the submitted value from the form. We did that in the previous module. Now, the null operator here gives us a default empty string, say if the value is missing. And then this trim here, this trim, that's going to remove all of the extra spaces from the beginning and the end. So if they type in, say, their full name and then they've got space either at the beginning of them, typing in their name or at the end of them typing in the name, it's going to trim all of that off. It's going to remove all of that extra. So just at the beginning and the end, not in the middle or anything like that. And this gives us cleaner input to actually work with. Now next, I'm going to validate the required fields. For example, if full name and email are required, then I want to make sure that they're not empty. Okay, so I'm using this statement here. Okay, and this is basic validation. What it does is it stops the script if the required information is missing. So we're saying empty. We're using like a function to check to see if full name, the data, that the value that we stored in this variable, if it's empty, or if the value that we stored in email is empty. Okay, so, and this is the or. So, one or the other of these has to be true. Okay, and if either of these is true, then like I said, we're going to stop the script. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to sanitize the data before I actually insert it, okay? For a basic introductory example, I'm just going to use the function called strip tags to remove any HTML tags. So let me go ahead and type that out. Okay, so let me do this last one while you're watching. Okay, so like I said, we use this function here, the strip tags function, in order to remove any HTML. Now, this is not the only type of sanitizing that we can do, but it's a good basic step for this module. Okay, so again, I know that I kind of type off camera because I type very slow. But go ahead and pause the video if you need to be able to copy this. So basically, what we're saying is we're stripping, taking the variable value. So we're taking that variable value, we're running it through this function, the strip tag function, and then we're resaving it back to the same variable name. Okay, so one thing you just want to make sure that the names, everything is correct. It may flag you if it's not, and it may not flag you. But just make sure spelling and things like that is really important. Okay, so now that now I'm going to include the connection file. Okay, that we made. Remember in module 6. And this is going to give us access to the PDO object, that connects to our database. So for that, I'm just going to do an include. And it was db connect.php. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and save because especially since I'm working online, I never want to make sure that I don't lose connection and then I lose everything that I've typed. So periodically make sure that you go up here and you save, okay? Okay, so now we're ready to insert our data. And this is probably the most important part for assignment 1. I'm going to write an SQL insert statement using named placeholders. Okay, so here's my statement, my SQL insert statement. Okay, and I'm using placeholders. So, one thing I want you to notice is that I'm not directly putting the user values, which is, these variables here. I'm not directly putting that into SQL. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm using placeholders, like in the way we write this is colon and then whatever the name of the placeholder is, colon, whatever the name of the placeholder, things like that. And this is what makes this a prepared statement. And I'll provide some additional links to information about prepared statements. But this is what's creating that prepared statement. We don't want to, remember in the lecture I mentioned, we don't want to actually insert directly into our database, from like our values, because it may contain, some corrupt data. It may contain, some malicious data or something like that. And that's where like your SQL injections and things like that come in. Okay, so now I'm going to prepare the SQL and then execute it with the actual values. So let me type that. Okay, so this is where PDO safely binds the values to the SQL query and then sends it to MySQL. And this is going to be much safer, like I said, than manually building a query string. So we basically start off with this prepared statement here, and we're taking the value of that variable, okay, and then calling that function to prepare it. And then here is where, like I said, we're actually executing it. So when we execute it, what we're doing is we're taking the placeholders, okay, and we're populating them with the actual values from the variables, okay. All right, now, after, say, a successful insert, we want to show a confirmation message. Okay, so here's our message. So after everything runs successfully, um, then we are going to echo out this message. Thank you. Your volunteer form has been submitted successfully. Now, maybe, later on you might want to have it redirect to a thank you page or something like that. But for this assignment, the confirmation message is perfectly fine. Okay, and then if there's any issue with any of this, then we're gonna, like I said, you know, go to as far as the else statement. Okay, so that's it for that's the core code, okay, for assignment 1. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my live form and fill it out and just kind of test it. Okay, so here's my form here. So I'm going to go ahead and complete the information. Okay, so go ahead and complete the information for your form. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and submit. Okay, we got an error message, so let's troubleshoot and let's figure out what the problem is. Okay, so let me show you something, and like I said in the beginning of this video, I want to be able to show you when things don't work, what you have to do. So one of the things that you can do is at the very top. So our problem is here when we go to submit the form. Okay, that's where we know we're hitting the error. We're seeing our form, correctly being displayed. Okay, but it's when we go to click submit and it posts over to the submit form is where we're getting our issues. So I want to be able to see, and this is something that you'll put on your system just while you're troubleshooting, and once you've worked everything out, then you want to go ahead and remove it. But I'm going to go in here and I'm actually going to insert an extra line in my code, and what this does is it tells PHP, okay, to show me all the errors, okay, instead of hiding them, okay. Okay, so again, keep in mind this error, this is gonna be displayed for development only. In real production sites, we don't want to show any kind of database errors because it is going to reveal some additional information possibly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. And then the way that SiteGround works is sometimes you have to clear out your cache when you do something different. It caches your files and things like that. And sometimes you need to clear it out when you make a change and you want to see that change take effect really quickly. So if under the menu here, if you go under speech, you'll see caching. And I always keep this window, this tab in a tab that's visible so that I can, especially when I'm developing, so that I can kind of keep bouncing back and forth to this. But under caching, what you want to do is you want to click on dynamic cache, and then all we do is we flush. So we're flushing the cache, okay? So now we come here and you would refresh. I've already refreshed, so I don't need to do that, but refresh the form just so that it, pulls the most current information into your information again. And then you're going to go ahead and click on submit. And see here, it gives you the error message. And what stands out to me is my typo. Okay, it's saying call to undefined function string dot underscore tags. It should actually be strip, not string. So that's going to be an easy fix for us. Okay, so we're going to go back to our form. And then we're going to change this. We did it right for the first one, but here we kind of typed it wrong. And again, typos can cause major problems. So let's go ahead and save that. Okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to clear my cache out again. Okay, I'm going to go back. Okay, and I shouldn't have to refresh this information. So let's just see. Maybe I don't have to refresh it. Okay. And I got another typo. Okay. So let's see. What do we got? Oh my goodness. Okay. So this is why I type off camera, because I am not a good typer. Okay. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's clear that out again. Let's go back. Okay. And let's click OK, access. So there's an issue with the username and password that I put in. So let me go in and let me fix that off camera. But you see how that error message allows you to be able to see, that those extra couple of lines allows you to be able to see what you need to troubleshoot. So let me fix this, my username and password off camera, and we'll come back. Okay, so I've gone ahead and fixed that. What happened is after I do videos, I always change up my user information, and I forgot to make the modifications in the file. So let's go back here. So we need to, once I've made those changes, I need to go ahead and flush my cache again. Okay, and I'm just going to come here, and again, this shouldn't be the issue. This index.php form is not the issue. It was the other form, so I shouldn't have to refresh this. So let's go ahead and click submit. Okay, and it says connected successfully, base table or view not found. Okay, so let me go in and fix that. And again, it shows us, the information shows us what we need to fix. It even shows you what line the problem is on, which of course is the PDO execution statement. So let me go in and fix that. Okay, so the problem is my name of my table is volunteers underscore T. Okay, but here I'm just saying volunteer. So I have to say underscore. Let me just make sure it's an S. Yeah, it is an S. Okay, so you see how things have to actually be exact. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save that. Okay, we need to go back. And again, it's good that these, we're running into these issues, because I just want you to see just how exact everything has to be. Okay, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to flush the cache again. Okay, let's cross our fingers that that's the last thing, but if it's not, that's okay. It shows us how we can troubleshoot some more. Okay, there we go. So connected successfully, and that was from that
the DB Connect. So, we would go ahead and comment this out so that it, doesn't like say that again. All we need was just our message that we wanted, and then it's showing as far as what we received. So we see that confirmation message here that we added, and then this was just left over from module 6, and that's okay. So if you saw your message with no errors, that's a great thing, okay? But if not, like I said, use that code that we placed at the beginning, okay, so that it actually tells you the error messages that's going on. And then what it does, it stops at each error message and then it reports whatever that error message is. Okay, so next thing I want to do is I want to verify that the record was actually inserted in the database. So what we're going to do is come back over to our phpMyAdmin, and then remember I told you this Browse tab shows us all the records. The Structured tab shows us how the table is structured, but the Browse actually shows us what records are in that table. So we click on this, and there we go. There's our record that we added. So now we see that row that we just inserted. Now, this is an important moment in the demo because it confirms that the full process worked. Okay, the form submitted correctly, eventually. PHP received the values, PDO inserted the data, and then the MySQL stored it in the table. And that completes assignment number 1. So let's just pause and let's make sure the big idea is clear here. Assignment 1 is not just about writing PHP code. It's about completing the form handling process securely. You're taking data from the user, you're validating it, okay? You're cleaning it, and then you're inserting it into the database using prepared statement. Now, this is a major step towards building a real dynamic website.
Okay, now that we have successfully stored form submissions in the database, we're ready for the second assignment. Now the next step is to retrieve those saved records and display them on a page. And this is where we move from data collection to data display.
Okay, so for assignment 2, I'm going to create a new file called submissions.php. And this page is going to connect to the database. It's going to run a select query, retrieve the saved volunteer submissions, and then display them in an HTML table. Okay, so I'm going to go back over here, and under module 6, I want to say I want a new file. Okay, and we're going to call this, like I said, submissions.php. Okay, and the first thing, well, besides our PHP tags, okay, the first thing that I want to do is I want to include that same database connection file that we've been using, the DB Connect. So I'm going to say include DB Connect PHP. Okay, and this is one reason why it's so useful to keep your database connection in a separate reusable file. Okay, so next I'm going to write a query to retrieve all of the records from the volunteer table. Okay, so here's the where we're going to be retrieving all of the records. Okay, and don't worry, I will be posting my code also within the course room, so that you can look at it. But let me explain what this does. Okay, so one is we're selecting all. So this asterisk here, this means to retrieve all of the columns. Okay, if we only wanted certain columns to be retrieved, then we would list those columns separated by commas. Okay, but we want all the columns. Okay, so we're retrieving all of the columns from our volunteer table. Okay, and we've made sure that we spelled it correctly this time. I mean, use the correct name this time. Okay. And so that's what it's doing. It's selecting all the columns from the volunteer table. And then we're saying ordered by, submitted at, um, descending, which means that we want to show the newest submissions first. So the submitted by, remember that's the date that the record got stored in our database, and descending order, by default it does ascending order, which means it takes the most, you know um, the latest, I mean the last or the first date, and then it goes in a ascending order. We want it where we're seeing the newest submissions first, so we want it in a descending order. Okay. um, and then we go ahead and we run the PDO query function, with this SQL statement. This, we stored this in the variable, and we're running that query function on that statement, and we're storing it into the statement variable here. And then this line here just gives us the results as an associative array, which is easier to loop through when we're in PHP. And again, I'll put a little bit more information about, like, if we hadn't talked about associative arrays and things like that, I'll put some information about that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an HTML table to display the submissions. And I'm going to create just a standard table with, headers like ID, full name, all of the different things that we had in our database. And then I'm going to use a PHP loop to output one table row at a time. So one table row will be for each record. Okay. So let me do that. Okay, so remember now this HTML, this is going to go outside of that PHP tag. Okay, so what's going to happen is it's going to run this first. Okay, and then what I want you to do is go ahead and build just the same way that you would build an HTML page. Okay, you're going to be building it outside of that PHP tag. So I gave mine a little bit of styling as well. But basically, this is my table. Like I said, I've got my different table headers here. Okay, that's going to represent each one of the columns that's in my database. And then I've got here, I'm doing that loop. So this is the loop that I'm doing, so that, remember, I stored this within submissions. Okay, I stored all the records within submissions. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually looping through that array, that I created. Okay, remember, it stores it in that associative array. Okay, and like I said, that associative array is going to be easier to loop through as far as PHP. Now, what I also want to show you, this is where that HTML special characters function that we talked about earlier becomes like really important. Okay, every value that gets printed on the page should be escaped. Okay, that's what we're doing here. And that means instead of printing the raw database content directly, okay, what I did was I wrapped each. So this is printing. Remember, it's an associative array. Okay, so it is going to be named, okay, instead of just using indexes. And again, I'll provide some information about arrays in the course room for you to take a look at. But I wrapped each one of these, like I said, within this HTML special characters function. Okay, and that's going to protect the page from any unsafe output. Okay. And then what I'm having, this is running within this PHP. Make sure that this is PHP. Make sure that you're enclosing any PHP within PHP tags, okay, like I'm doing here, okay? And so basically this for each is the loop that it's using, and it's going to keep running this until it gets to the end, until it runs out of records. And again, this page, what it's doing is it's pulling data from the database and then displaying it into this kind of readable table here. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. Okay. Okay, so now let's go over here and let's add, we're going to be viewing under the module 6, because that's where we stored it. We're going to be viewing that submissions page. Why is it doing that? It's weird. Let me just type it out. Okay. All right, so if you've added, you should have added a record or more than one record or whatever. So you should see all of your records here. If I had submitted, like I said, more volunteer forms, then I would just refresh this page and I'd be able to see, the new records as well. Okay, so at this point, we've got a full dynamic workflow working. The user fills out the volunteer form, the form sends data to the submit, form.php. That file validates, sanitizes, and inserts the data into our MySQL database. And then this submissions um, form here, or this submission.php file here, retrieves that saved data and then it displays it in an HTML table. And this is a complete beginning to end example of database-driven web development.
Now, before we wrap it up, let me point out a few common mistakes that I've seen students run into with this module. First are mismatched field names. Remember, if the form uses one name and the PHP expects another, the fields are not going to come through correctly. The second is incorrect table or column names in the SQL query. If the name is called volunteer, but say the code says volunteers with an S, then the query is going to fail. Third is forgetting to include the db_connect.php. Without the connection file, PDO can't talk to the database. Fourth, forgetting to escape output with the HTML special characters function when displaying records. And then last and fifth, uploading the real credentials to GitHub. Remember, only push, a sample like a db_connect_sample.php, where you've added placeholder values. Never upload your real credentials to GitHub. That should only exist on the actual web server on SiteGround. Okay, so let's summarize what we've accomplished in this module. You learned how to collect user input from a form using POST. You validated and you sanitized submitted input. You inserted that input directly into MySQL using PDO prepared statements. You retrieved saved data with a select query, and you displayed that data safely in an HTML table using the HTML special characters function. Now, this is a major milestone because you now have a completed workflow for collecting, storing, and displaying user data. Now, for assignment 1, remember your goal is to take your existing volunteer form and update your submit underscore form.php so that the data is inserted securely into your MySQL table using PDO prepared statements. For assignment 2, your goal is to create a submissions.php page where you're going to retrieve those stored records and then display them clearly in a table. Now make sure you test both pages live on SiteGround and make sure that your GitHub repository includes your updated PHP files and your sample connection file without your real credentials. So at this point, your project is no longer just a front-end website. It's now becoming a real database-driven application. And that's a big step. And it's actually the kind of workflow used in real-world web development. All right, that wraps up Module 7.